is not for those who are ignorant and saying that, oh, harsh words, this is contrary to the sunnah. No, it's not. Mockery is not against the sunnah. Mockery of those who are deviating and distorting the religion is not contrary to the sunnah. It's actually prescribed by the sunnah. So when I sarcastically call people simp imam or compassionate imam, this is not contrary to the sunnah. And Imam Ghazali is, advising this kind of approach.
Hello, and peace be with you. Please forgive me, I've had to bring back my AI friend to narrate this, as I am having issues with my acoustics. But trust me, it will still be interesting and articulate, I promise. Salafists. Traditionalist Sunnis. Muslim conservatives. Whatever the correct term is, anyone who is even a casual consumer of YouTube plus Islam cannot have missed them. They have become quite a phenomenon on the internet, self-righteously preaching their narrow interpretation of Islam, and pining for a return of the caliphate. One of the most hilarious ironies I find about these guys, and let's be clear, they are always guys, is how they always try and present an image of their ideal Islamic society as some blissful utopia for Muslims to live in, emphasizing their freedom to practice their religion. And then when they go into the details of this society, they end up explaining how cruel and dictatorial it will be in practice, basically governed by fear. Exhibit A, one of the popular hardliners, who goes by the name the Muslim Skeptic, whom I will henceforth refer by his real name, Daniel. And I must say, he is one of the more arrogant and self-righteous of these preachers. Here he is, praising the guidelines set out by the famous medieval polymath, Al-Ghazali, on how Muslims should deal with the willful transgressing of their fellow Muslims. And spoiler alert, it's not a guide that's based on tolerance and understanding, and most definitely not one based on a live and let live attitude. Here we will see Al-Ghazali's guideline involves a staged approach which starts off rather benignly, with gentle advice, but escalates first into harsh admonition, and finally, if the sinner persists in their transgressions, to full-blown force, using physical violence.
What is the status of critique of anyone? And we look at what Imam Ghazali says, actually, in Ihya Ulum ad-Din. In Ihya Ulum ad-Din, there's a section where Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, talks about Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahi anil Munkar, and it's been translated, so I want to share that with you. Let me just bring it on the screen. Okay, it might be a little bit small, but I'll read it for you. Enjoining good and forbidding evil. So this is the section, and there's a subsection, the modes of prevention of sin. So this is what the Imam says. Know, O dear readers, that there are different modes of prevention of sins in different stages. The first stage is to know the condition of the sinner. The second stage is to inform him of the harm of sin. The third stage is to prevent him from doing the sinful act. The fourth stage is to advise him and give him admonition. The fifth stage is to rebuke him and use harsh words. The sixth stage is to apply force. The seventh stage is to give him threat of beating. The eighth stage is to actually beat him. The ninth stage is to use weapons against him. And 10th stage is to fight against him, followers and soldiers. So this is quite, direct. But look at the wisdom of what he's describing.
Yes, I am particularly looking forward to hearing the wisdom of deploying actual weapons to beat someone up for doing something that you disapprove of. That will indeed be interesting.
So in the first stage, so he's describing these stages. The first stage, one should not inquire what is occurring in a house, but if anyone informs you that a certain man is drinking wine or doing some unlawful act, it then becomes your duty to prevent it. So the first thing is to inquire about the condition of the sinner.
Right, so here he clearly spells out that drinking alcohol is one of those unlawful activities that Al-Ghazali says becomes your duty to prevent. And to be clear, this is not drinking in a way that causes public disorder. They are not rampaging through the street causing drunken chaos. He said it himself, this is specifically an act in the privacy of one's own home. Someone just minding their own business, doing their own thing, not harming anyone. This is the sort of act Al-Ghazali says becomes your duty to prevent, up to and including using physical violence. Just so we're absolutely crystal clear on this. So he then goes on to expand on these progressive stages. And I'll skip over the first three stages, as they are not terribly controversial, as they are basically little more than trying to reason with the sinner, and using polite admonition. Things which I don't think most people would object to, regardless of your belief system. So we jump straight to the fourth stage, which is the abuse stage.
The fourth stage is abuse and using harsh words. Okay, so the idea is the progression happens if the person you're advising does not take the advice. If the person you're rebuking does not change his ways, he just continues. He is obstinate. He is arrogant. He will not take your admonition. If the person refuses to change his behavior, then that's where you advance through these stages to get to the fourth stage. And Imam Ghazali says, abuse, use harsh words. If there is a good result in the use of soft words with the wrongdoer, harsh words should not be resorted to. So if you advise someone and use soft words, you're gentle, and they change their ways, then don't escalate, right? When it fails, when the soft words fail, then use harsh words and abuse him. Because some of these zanadiqa, some of these deviants, they feel like they're above the law. They feel like they can promote every kind of deviance. They can violate every principle of Islam that they want and face no consequence. And if you are calling them out for that, then that is ghaiba, that is backbiting, or that is slander, or this is disrespect, or this is like all of these excuses are used. But in reality, there's been a progression. And then you even get to the stage where you can even insult. Oh fool, oh ignorant one. This is what Imam Ghazali is recommending for those who are obstinate. They are not changing their ways. They're arrogant. They want to continue. So then we are entitled to escalate, and that is for the benefit, to turn people away from such individuals who cause so much deception, cause so much deviance in the Muslim community. There is a need for that. And it is not contrary to the sunnah. It is not contrary to prophetic wisdom to use harsh language. So that is not for those who are ignorant and saying that, oh, harsh words, this is contrary to the sunnah. No, it's not. Mockery is not against the sunnah. Mockery of those who are deviating and distorting the religion is not contrary to the sunnah. It's actually prescribed by the sunnah. And Imam Ghazali is, advising this kind of approach.
I'll have to take his word for it. That mockery is prescribed by the sunnah. It would not surprise me, and it just reinforces my view of the legitimacy of the sunnah. So whatever. But let's just take a step back and clarify the context of these guidelines. We are not talking about Muslims dealing with non-Muslims who are committing non-Islamic acts. He is only talking about how Muslims should deal with other Muslims who are supposedly transgressing. For these hardliners, it is extremely important that they get involved in other Muslims' lives and play an active role in ensuring they keep each other on the right path. This is fine and understandable. To an extent. But really, what sort of society are we advocating where we consider it acceptable, even necessary, to resort to abusing each other for committing acts that don't abide by our religious beliefs? And again, I emphasize, we are not just talking about acts that cause direct harm to society, such as assaulting or murdering people, vandalism, drunken hooliganism, etc. We heard him cite at the beginning the very specific example of someone drinking alcohol in the privacy of their own home.
One should not inquire what is occurring in a house, but if anyone informs you that a certain man is drinking wine or doing some unlawful act, it then becomes your duty to prevent it.
And in fact, we can safely assume that for hardliners like Daniel, any private behavior that they believe is non-Islamic would be applicable here. Like, for example, eating non-halal food.
Brother, is it okay to eat store-bought meat in southern USA, which is more Christian, and fast food like Zaxby's or Chick-fil-A? And why, if it's allowed or not? No, it's not allowed to eat that kind of meat because you don't know who has slaughtered it. You don't know, like, this idea that they're Christian. Like, these major multinational meat processing companies are not Christian. They're not owned by Christians. They're like, some of them are public companies. Like, they're publicly traded companies, so there's no Christian ownership, let alone a Christian who is actually slaughtering your meat or doing anything like properly cutting it, properly doing the dhabiha. So it's not halal. That is the position that I have, and that is the correct position.
See how there is no hesitation, no ambiguity here. It is clearly not permissible. End of discussion. So what's my point? Well, just consider, you are an average Muslim living in America, and you decide to get some takeaway chicken. And to be clear, there is a significant section of the Muslim community who believe that chicken prepared in the West is permissible for Muslims. And for doing this, you have the likes of Daniel, telling his not insignificant audience that it is not only permissible, but in fact the duty of Muslims to step in and take non-violent action to try and stop this behavior, up to and including the use of verbal abuse, and the sinisterly vague term, harsh words. And as Daniel clarifies later, the sorts of transgressions he is talking about can extend to simply making arguments for different theological or ideological viewpoints.
When it comes to this context of criticizing these imams for their promotion of liberalism and secularism and their attack on khilafah, etc., we can only use our words.
And that just opens a whole other can of worms, doesn't it? How far do you think this abuse and harsh words can be taken? Of course, Daniel covers himself later and is careful to not condone Al-Ghazali's call for actual physical violence, and even includes a disclaimer later about how it shouldn't include threats to violence. But surely isn't abuse intimidatory by its very nature? Especially if there is a power imbalance between the abuser and the person being abused to start with. I am thinking particularly about a scenario involving a man abusing a woman, which I'll point out, Daniel never rules out as a possible scenario. And indeed Daniel himself doesn't hold back in resorting to abusive-like behavior towards women.
There are so many things wrong with this hadith.
There's so many things wrong. There's so many things wrong with this.
Is the amount of abuse implied in this. What if my
Abuse. The amount of abuse applied in this. There's so much abuse in this hadith.
You stay classy.
Now here's the rub. I want you to imagine a plausible scenario, in which Daniel is in the physical presence of this Muslim woman, and he heard her making this same sort of critique of hadiths. Daniel, following his own stated convictions, is religiously duty-bound to confront her about it. Now let's give Daniel the benefit of the doubt and assume that he will start off with polite objections and kind rebukes. But what does he do if she disagrees and continues to argue her case? In that case, from Daniel's point of view, she is being willfully deviant to the teachings of Islam. It is literally impossible for him, according to his stated convictions, to leave her alone. He must escalate. I hope now this is starting to sink in, how this is actually quite a scary, not to mention potentially dangerous scenario. From Daniel's perspective, he not only has the right to start abusing her, he is actually duty-bound to do so. Just let that sink in for a moment. Just try and imagine how traumatic an experience this would be for this woman, to have this physically big, assertive and frankly arrogant man, shouting and hurling abuse at her. And abusing her, not because of an emotional, spur-of-the-moment, impulsive reaction, but actually as part of a cold, calculated, pre-planned process. And never forget that this procedure for dealing with transgressors within Islam is the same procedure that seamlessly escalates straight to the use of physical violence. A procedure that Daniel praises for its wisdom and only disavows the physical violence on account of it being against his country's non-Islamic laws, not because of any stated moral opposition he has to it. Thus, through his insinuations, Daniel would presumably support and promote a system in which he could, in this scenario, resort to actual physical assault of this woman.
So the fifth stage is to correct evil by hand, such as pouring down wine, taking off silk from the body, ejecting from a land unlawfully occupied. This method should be adopted after the failure of the first four stages. Keep correction within limit and don't exceed what is necessary. So this is important caveat. We can't progress to this stage because we don't have the authority. So these imams, we don't have any authority to do anything with our hands. So put that out of your mind. We can only go to fourth stage because we don't have the authority to do anything physically. It's against the law. We don't have the authority. It's not our place.
Daniel makes this important caveat. So credit where credit's due. Well done, Daniel. But the question I immediately ask myself is he actually condemning the use of violence as a general principle here? And the answer is no. Why? Note how he uses his words. We don't have the authority to resort to violent measures, he says. He doesn't say there is anything inherently immoral about such violent measures. And just look at what this video is about. Look at the title of the video, for crying out loud. Legendary Imam says. In his introduction he describes the wisdom of this guidance, which of course includes 3 stages of physical violence. He doesn't praise only the first non-violent stages and completely disassociates from the violent stages. No. What does he say instead? We can't do these violent acts because we don't have the authority. Not because it's an inherently bad or immoral thing to do.
If you do have the authority, then you can take those measures. Someone who has authority is like a government official or someone who is in some of these ministries. They might have the ability or the authority to do that.
So here it is spelled out more clearly. If authority to be violent against transgressors exists, then it's okay. And presumably perfectly moral, and even necessary. So clearly, if Daniel and his ilk ever got their wish to form and live in a pure, Islamic state, authority for such violence would be coming out the wazoo. There would basically be no limit to the permissible use of violence in that case. And wouldn't he just love that? And we can only imagine what a lovely utopian state that would be. Where anyone who dares to commit acts that differ from the state's narrow interpretation of Islamic law, even within the privacy of their own home, will be open season to insults, abuse, threats, intimidation, and ultimately, to physical violence. Back to the video, Daniel then moves on to the 6th stage, which is a call for much more direct physical violence. He then goes off on a bit of a tangent, to point out how this guide by Al-Ghazali supports a different view of Islam that is commonly preached by Muslims who are less hardline than Daniel.
And Imam Al-Ghazali is supposed to be depicted as this, he's a Sufi, soft, all about spirituality. He's saying, use threats.
And violence. Don't forget, actual physical violence.
Again, this is illegal. If you don't have the authority to do this, do not break the law, do not issue threats. But I'm reading this for educational purposes so that you understand what some of the great imams of our history have actually said regarding Amr bin Ma'ruf. Because you have a long history, unfortunately, in recent history, of these compassionate imams who have distorted Islam and they've made Islam seem like these things are not part of it, which is not true. And they've kind of fed into this, don't judge. You should never even judge people, let alone criticize them, let alone insult them, let alone threaten them. You shouldn't even judge anyone, for public sins that they do openly. So that's how far things have fallen, unfortunately.
What exactly is your point here, Daniel? What exactly is the purpose of this, up yours to compassionate Muslims? How are we to interpret this little rant, other than as some seriously messed up yearning for less tolerance and more violence in Islam and amongst its adherents? You seem to go out of your way to frame your discouragement of violence only in terms of it being against the laws of your non-Islamic home country in the West. Not because there is anything inherently wrong or immoral with it. Why else would you be showcasing these violent guidelines, all the while belittling Muslims who call for peace and tolerance in the religion? You might be covering all your bases from a technical legal point of view, but your moral position in relation to your preference for a more violent and intolerant society couldn't be more clearly insinuated. Finally, in conclusion, Daniel makes a closing statement about how useful it is to understand what such medieval scholars as Al-Ghazali were advising in regards to the proper Islamic way of dealing with transgressors within the religion.
But it's still good to understand what the imams have taught and what they've said about the reality of Amr bin Ma'ruf Nahi Anil Munkar. What is it? The reality is to bring about good, and to ward off evil by any means necessary. And so sometimes that will require physical means and even war. And Islam is very clear about that.
So Daniel finally lets the cat out of the bag. Here he is more explicit than he has ever been, in promoting the use of violence to, in his words, bringing about good and warding off evil. And just so we're absolutely crystal clear here, he is not talking about violence as a necessary evil to be used for self-defense if your community is under direct physical or military threat. You heard him at the beginning, he is specifically referring to things that people choose to do in the privacy of their own homes. He and Al-Ghazali are directly calling for Muslims to interfere in people's personal lives and aggressively harass them until they conform to your way of behaving. This is literally what Daniel is promoting, even if he stops short of condoning actual physical violence. This is his idea of true Islam. One that is completely intolerant of different views, aggressive towards transgressors, and if necessary, violent.
And other legal systems are clear about that too. They give the legal authority to executive powers to enforce the law through violence. And if people do not obey, then you escalate. There's escalation. So there's a fine. If you don't pay your fine, there are seizures. If you don't vacate your property when they're trying to seize it, they can imprison you. If you resist, they can kill you. Like, there's escalation, even within the secular legal system. But Islam acknowledges that, and Islam says that this is a part of religion, whereas in the West, it's a part of the secular state.
No, Daniel, the secular legal system in modern democracies no longer make laws, let alone take violent measures against the sorts of things you clearly think they should. Things like consuming beverages in the privacy of your own home, or promoting ideas that are different to the mainstream. Only you, and your sick following, want these things to be illegal and stamped out by any means necessary, including with the use of violence. And that concludes today's video. An exquisite masterclass in turd polishing by another hardliner. Till next time, peace be with you.